The inside story on the issues that affect you and your community. This is Local 12 Newsmakers.
Members of the jury, have you reached a verdict?
We, the jury, find George Zimmerman not guilty.
What do we want? Justice! What do we want? Now!
The decision in the George Zimmerman Trayvon Martin case in Florida impacted people across the country, including here in Cincinnati, reminding everyone that the issues we wish were behind us are not. Good morning and welcome to Local 12 Newsmakers. I'm Dan Hurley. The shooting of death of Trayvon Martin by George Zimmerman in Florida last year, in combination with the not guilty jury verdict last Saturday, has raised a host of issues around the role of the justice system, the cultural implications of laws beyond their specific focus, and ongoing difficulty of members of different races to understand each other's experiences of life in America. To work through some of those issues, I'm joined this morning by Marcus Coleman, a criminal defense attorney here in Cincinnati. Before becoming an attorney, Mr. Coleman was a teacher in the Cincinnati Public Schools. And the Reverend Damon Lynch, Jr., the pastor of New Jerusalem Baptist Church in Carthage for 43 years, and a civil rights leader in Cincinnati for even longer. Reverend Lynch, welcome back to Newsmakers. Marcus, welcome to Newsmakers.
Sure, thank you.
Let's begin with the legal situation. You're a defense attorney. So how do you see the decision that was rendered here and the case that was argued here? I mean, it was argued on a very narrow legal question of whether this was self-defense.
Sure.
And what's your view of that as a criminal defense attorney?
I think that one of the things you have to look at is that this case largely turned on a very, very narrow point, and that was whether or not you believe that Trayvon Martin initiated the contact with Mr. Zimmerman, or whether or not Mr. Zimmerman was the person who initiated that contact. And if you believe that it was Mr. Zimmerman who did so, you would likely have found that he probably, based on some of the other things that we learned about this case, that there was if you follow all of that to a logical conclusion, then somehow he created the situation, and maybe it was Trayvon Martin who was defending himself. In the alternative, if you believe that somehow that Trayvon Martin initiated the contact with Mr. Zimmerman, then you're likely to have accepted his belief that he feared for his life, had a reasonable fear for his life, and therefore he was at that point privileged to use deadly force. So it really depends on whether or not you believe.
What does contact mean in a legal sense? Because I guess from one point of view, you can say George Zimmerman got out of his car, pursued Trayvon Martin, but what does contact mean? Are we talking, does contact get defined as physical contact in that situation?
Well, I know that it was being argued from the defense standpoint that Trayvon Martin initiated physical contact with Mr. Zimmerman. However, all a person really needs to believe is that deadly force is imminent, that someone's about to use deadly force against you. You don't have to actually wait for that, but it does have to be imminent. It has to be a reasonable fear. And so one could argue that if Trayvon Martin sees this gentleman following him, doesn't know this gentleman, is somewhat spooked by this guy, that maybe he is privileged to then somehow defend himself, even though there's been no physical contact as of that point. But the way that it was argued from the defense standpoint is that Trayvon Martin actually initiated physical contact. So more so than just the fact that Mr. Zimmerman left his car and did some of those things after that, their argument was that he had not made physical contact with Trayvon Martin, but Trayvon initiated the contact, and so Mr. Zimmerman was then privileged to defend himself. That was their argument.
And if you were the defense attorney, would that be an argument you could have argued?
I believe you'd have to. I think that one of the things that was very important here is that typically if you're going to argue a self-defense case, at some point, typically you have to have the defendant get on the stand and say, here's what happened here, particularly when the other person is deceased, as Trayvon Martin is. What the prosecution did was enter a lot of defense statements, a lot of statements that Mr. Zimmerman made, so he had no pressure to get on and explain anything because that had already been done for him. So I think that that was a mistake on the part of the prosecution, is to allow him to speak through their case in chief, which you typically do not.
Reverend Lynch, looking at this from a broader point of view, this decision came down last Saturday, Sunday morning at church. How were people receiving this, reacting to it?
Calm at my church, but you could feel a sense of tension. And it was probably about 20 minutes before we got into the service. before I could sense that there was a settling down. People were expecting me to say something, and I didn't initially say anything right off the bat. I just went on with the regular order of service. This is at the 8 o'clock service. By 11 o'clock service, the whole thing was out, you know, so at 11 o'clock I said something initially.
In the sense that people hadn't heard about it when they arrived.
Right.
Okay.
And so my job at that point was try to calm the fears of people and let them know that God was still in charge, that this is not the first time this has happened. It probably won't be the last time, unfortunately, that this will happen. And we just have to keep pressing and doing the things that we do and that we've always been successful at doing, and trusting God for making sure that everything will be all right. And plus doing what we're going to be doing this coming Saturday, having a demonstration down at the Federal Building across this country, 100 cities, and that sort of thing. And so, and then work on the laws, this stand your ground law and all these other laws that these people are putting out now. It's just overkill.
You know, I think that is an interesting part of all of this, that it's not just the laws that were in play in the courtroom, but there was a background here, because the stand your ground law never got raised in the courtroom.
Right.
So it really becomes a question, do the laws that are out there establish an environment that we have to pay attention to, even if they're not the ones that are directly in play in the narrow legal sense or the court sense? Right. And first off, does Ohio have a stand your ground law?
No, I would not be surprised to see it. To see that someone bring it up, it would not surprise me. Essentially, what's happening here is that there's always been this notion that a man's home is his castle, and you have the right to defend yourself in your home. Now, what the laws are doing is they're turning every person into a turtle, so to speak, and so your home is wherever you are. And some people who are listening may say, well, yeah, I should have the right to defend myself. But what you're also going to be able to see is that people whose business it is to engage in violence, i.e. gang members or something of that nature, they could also say, hey, I know that guy's a gang member and, you know, he probably has a gun. I'm defending myself. I'm standing my ground. They'll be able to assert that privilege and do so successfully. So we have to be careful where this goes. You know, it's a very slippery slope that you find yourself on.
We have a lot of legislators now who from that old school of thought, like the other day, I had to accost a guy up in Springboro. You might have seen it in the paper. He flying the Confederate flag. He wants it flown into school. He unfurled it and put it up, and they had to make him take it down. And he wants all kinds of stuff. He's still fighting the Civil War, you know. I mean, it's like guys back up in the hills, not knowing that the war's over, not knowing that this is America. We got one flag, but and he was adamant about it. So they called me and asked me if I would make a comment on it, and I did. Then telling him that he needs to do his history a little bit better and go further, because the war is over. And so we cannot allow that sort of thing to be happening here in 2013. So those fights are still going on. And the lawmakers, a lot of these lawmakers are putting these laws in, and it's kind of hard to deal with them because everybody's got a gerrymandered state, and it's kind of rough. So we have to persevere in voting and getting people out to try to get people in there to change these laws.
And this also relates to the proliferation of the owning of guns.
Yes, big time.
And I think the statistics say, especially among young gang members, there's a lot of guns out there, which very honestly affects the African-American community in a way that it doesn't affect the total community.
Certainly.
Right. And what do we do about that?
You know, one of the things that I find somewhat interesting is that I grew up here in Cincinnati, Wind Terrace, and the first time I'd ever held a gun or saw a gun, even I was in the Army. So, I mean, I got through my entire life of living where I lived and attending Taft High School, although there was the Derek Turnbull shooting, which was my senior year of high school. But even that was not a traditional, you know, gun-toting kind of thing. But it just wasn't happening that way. I think that what's happening here is that there's a misconception. I don't think these children are more violent. I think their violence is much more lethal now because there's the proliferation of guns, as you stated. Yeah. And so somehow what we have to do is we have to remove that aspect of respect that's attached to violence and aggression. And that's the biggest problem that we have. It's not so much whether or not we can convince them to put the guns down. There's just too much respect attached to owning the gun. Right. And there's also that self-defense aspect of it that they all believe that they're having to pay homage to.
There's a thing going around now, and that I was sad to hear it, Because when I was a kid and hearing what you said, even when you were a child, coming up, that you did not have the if-I syndrome going as it is today. And the if-I, they're saying in the urban areas, if I grow up, I want to be something. We never even entertained the fact that we wouldn't grow up. Now it's if I grow up. Chicago, if I grow up. Detroit, all of the cities where all of these people in Cincinnati, if I grow up, I want to be something. And that's a bad thing for kids to have to wrestle with and miss their childhood wondering if they're going to grow up because of the proliferation of guns and the shootings in our communities.
I want to listen to a short soundbite from Eric Holder, who's the Attorney General of the United States. This was early this past week, after the decision was made, speaking to a sorority, and I think it was in Washington, D.C. that the speech was made. Just one section.
We are resolved, as you are, to combat violence involving or directed at young people, to prevent future tragedies, and to deal with the underlying attitudes, mistaken beliefs, and stereotypes that serve as the basis for these two common incidents.
You know, I mean, I think that encapsulates sort of what we're talking about here. There's the legal side, and then there's the larger set of assumptions, ideas, stereotypes that are operative. And, you know, how do we approach all of that is really, I think, what we're left with after this decision.
I think that that conversation requires a tremendous amount of courage, and it's a level of courage that we've not always demonstrated. First thing we have to do is we have to be willing to acknowledge that we all subscribe to bias, and that's essentially what's happening here. The genesis of this interaction between Trayvon Martin and George Zimmerman was his own bias. He saw this young man and he made certain judgments about him based on his own perception, his own biases. And if we're not willing to acknowledge those, and I mean all people, I subscribe to them myself, it's implied, it's implicit, somehow you just don't even realize you're doing it. But until we're able to acknowledge that, then we can do something about it. But too many people don't have the conversation, either because it's politically correct to pretend that it doesn't exist, or we just don't want to make an honest examination of ourselves.
Well, that too, but yet a lot of people shy away from it because it's not economically feasible. A lot of whole things come into play based upon who we are. We are all God's children. And if we look at each other and esteem each other the way we ought to esteem each other, then these things wouldn't be happening. So when they look at us, they already make a judgment. We are not as they are. And when people can esteem you as the other, then you got some problems.
You're wearing, Reverend Lynch, you're wearing your National Underground Railroad Freedom Center button. Right. What's the role of that institution in our community?
Dialogue. Helping
to forward that discussion, that...
Dialogue. As a matter of fact, we're preparing and getting it ready now. Archbishop Brightenthal from the Archdiocese, he and I, and Marilyn Bates Mims, we're working on a racial profiling piece now for the diocese and the Council of Bishops.
The Episcopal Diocese.
Right, Episcopal Diocese, and so we're all in it together, so trying to get to a point where we can solve some of these things. And so that's what the Freedom Center does. We bring people in for dialogue. So we'll be bringing people from across the country to do dialogue about this, what's going on.
I'm basically out of time, but one last question. Dialogue in the community at large. Does a decision like this stir dialogue inside the legal community that's in the courtrooms on a day-by-day basis? Have you found yourself this past week talking to your fellow lawyers about this?
Lots of conversation. One of the things that we understand is that when you're in the courtroom and you have a micro view of these kinds of things, you understand how it looks in the courtroom. You understand that this was a plausible outcome. From a macro level, morally, God's eye view, you don't like it, but based on what we know about the courtroom, it was a plausible outcome.
Okay. Thank you very much for being here this morning. Thank you for the work you do in the community.
Right.
Hello, my name is Jennifer Crow. I'm an artist at Visionaries and Voices. How's everyone doing today?
Welcome back. Art is powerful. It allows people to find their voices. It allows others to move over and see the world, if only for a moment, through the experience and eyes of another. Visionaries and Voices is a relatively new organization that provides people with disabilities allows them not only to produce and share works of art, but also gives them continuous opportunities to learn, develop professionally, collaborate, exhibit, and celebrate with community members. A decade into its development, Visionaries and Voices represents over 150 local artists working in a wide variety of styles, backgrounds, and mediums. Here's a look at one artist, Ricky Michaels, who was featured on a YouTube video.
I started adding text to my work after I lost my sight. To the end of it, I realized that I can wake up every day and paint. Did I put too much pressure on you? Oh, that is too cool, man. I love that. I started out angry. I had no idea what was going to happen with it, but by the time I got to the end of it, it just took me down a different path. Oh, I like that. That's cool. Really, the smile.
To discuss the work of Visionaries and Voices, I'm joined this morning by Samantha Charek, the Outreach Director for Visionaries and Voices. Samantha is a graduate of Peace Corps, where she served in South Africa. And Fedrick Bullocks, an artist who works at Visionaries and Voices. Fedrick has been working at the Northside Studio and is a graduate of the Teaching Arts program, which was just featured on that video. And we can talk a little bit about that, because that's where you get to work with children in the community, right?
Yes, yes.
And is that fun?
Yes, I love it. I mean, I love the opportunities, how I'm able to, to help out and bless the young minds and teach them about art and explore they get a chance to explore their potential.
Yeah.
And as they're beginning to, they learn something new, and then they show their mothers or their fathers or people all over the place. And it's kind of interesting how when they do that, they come back to me and they show me like, hey, look, I did this and I did that. And it kind of makes you feel warm inside,
Yeah.
And you just want to just pour out more to them. And you just continue to pray that you're doing the right thing, steering them into the career that they want to go, perhaps.
Yeah, yeah. Samantha, how long have you been with Visionaries and Voices?
I've been with Visionaries and Voices for about 5 years.
About 5 years.
Yeah.
And what's your role as outreach director? What does that mean? Probably a lot of things in a small organization, right?
Yeah, yeah. It's evolved over that period of time. When I first started out, it meant trying to take the studio program that we offer in Northside and in Tri-County to people's homes if people weren't able to come into the studio. And while that still occurs, it's evolved into more of an opportunity for artists who have a desire to not just share their work in exhibitions throughout the city, but to take on leadership roles in the arts community. And in Fedrick's case, that means teaching. Sometimes that can mean public speaking as well.
There in your YouTube videos, and actually there's quite a few YouTube videos out there of Visionaries and Voices, there are a number of people who I know who show up as the artist. And I guess when we say people who have disabilities, what's the range? And gee, I guess people might think, gee, art wouldn't be of interest, or art isn't something they have an outlet for. What is it what's the range of people who are there, right? And why is this art important to the artist? Maybe that's what I'm trying to get at.
I think it's kind of like, I like to look at like what they call LD as learning different, not disability, because disability, it suppresses the person, where it truly handicaps the person where they can't do anything. But when you learn different as a different format, it's pretty much like Apple's slogan, what's their slogan, which is think different. I noticed when I went to school and they taught me how to work an Apple computer, I was able to just learn a lot, more, because it's geared for the artists. And Visionaries and Voices, they teach us where, there's no limit. You're not limited, you can be unlimited. It's kind of like you can do all things, and with the help of the top program, they kind of help, they build your confidence, they set you up with mentors. I like to look at them as counselors, where they're always putting positive
So is art always something you wanted to do, but Visionaries and Voices is taking you to a different level?
Yes, a different level.
Oh, I would say, I have to talk about that maybe because he'll talk about his work, but I have to say, Fedrick walked in the door an artist. And I would also add to that that's the attitude that we take in the studio. We're not teaching. That's really important. The artists that are working in our studio, they walk in the door, they're already passionately creating something. Oh, yes. And we're just here to be a conduit, to be a connector, to get our artists exposure in the community. And if that means occasionally building a few skills, if that's the only thing that's creating the barrier, then that's what we do.
Well, part of it can be that exhibition, having the opportunity to exhibit your work if you're an artist. And you do that. I know on Friday night, the show airs on Sunday, so on Friday night, you've just opened a new exhibit. What's that exhibit?
It's actually Thursday night. Is Urban Express, which is our big summer show, and it's featuring the work of DeAndre Hyde, which is a series of different portraits. Okay. Yeah.
Let's take a look at some of your work. Okay. You sent me a few things ahead of time. Here's one. How would you describe that? What were you doing? What were you working with there?
On this particular piece here, in my mind, I'm thinking like, pretty much like the Bible where I get my inspiration. It's called Different Mansion, okay? And instead of being the everyday blue skies, like your earth, blue skies, blue water, I figured, okay, red skies and red waters with blue trees. And that's the idea when I was creating this piece in watercolor. You know, it allows my mind to, I just love to create. So whatever's in my mind.
You're working in watercolor in this particular one?
Yes, in this particular piece.
Okay, let's take a look at the second one. This is a very different feel. Very, I would say...
Totally different.
Yeah, sort of abstract, working with shapes. What were you thinking here?
Okay, now this one here, you know, this is where I'm dealing with, you know, three-dimensional graphics. I'm thinking like, you know, simple stairway to heaven. And, you know, I just like how everything is shiny, and I'm creating my own worlds, my own universes, allowing the ideas that's inside my head, you know, and applying it and putting it onto canvas. And like I was saying, like how, you know, at Visionaries and Voices, I don't like to be into a box, being known as just an airbrush artist or just a pencil artist. I like to explore what's out there.
So what are you working in there? This isn't watercolor, is it?
No, this right here is in CG. Computer graphics.
Thank you.
I'm sorry.
Those of us who are left behind.
Okay.
You know, okay. Yeah. So you're working in computer graphics.
Fedrick knows more about computers and computer graphics than anyone I've ever met.
Well, once you get people together, you get artists walking through the door. Is there a exchange that takes place where you're working with each other?
Oh, yes. And that's the idea. I mean, you know, when you're working with each other, you can't help but to gain ideas. It's like whatever you don't know, I know, and I can teach you or show you, and or whatever you know, you show me and teach me. And that's how we all gain. And I like that attitude because you also develop a kind of sense of family, you know, a closeness, a bond. And, you know, you can trust people with kind of like you know them who you labor among. And that's the thing I love about Visionaries and Voices, how we all teach each other along with the TAP program, working with the mentors and everybody sharing their ideas. We have meetings from like once a week, twice a week, you know, and then the idea is like, well, what kind of thinker are you?
Rather than being isolated. You know. I'm running out of time, but one last thing. There's an exhibit at the Art Museum, which I really want people to know about because it puts a Visionaries and Voices artist together with a well-known Cincinnati artist, traditional artist, and it's really amazing exhibit. Can you just say a few things about that?
Certainly. That exhibit is called Cincinnati Every Day, and it was curated by Matt Distel, who was our previous executive director, and he's now adjunct curator there. And it features Courtney Cooper of Visionaries and Voices and Cole Carruthers, and they both have spent their lives drawing and creating works about the city of Cincinnati, and they're featured together, and they're just exceptional.
And there's very different approaches, and it is fascinating. I really recommend everybody sees that exhibit. That really pulled it together for me.
Yes.
Make sure people can find you. Visionaries and Voices has 2 studios, one in Northside on Spring Grove Avenue, just west of Knowlton's Corner, and the other in Tri-County on Northland Boulevard. To get more information, check out the website at visionariesandvoices.com or the Facebook page, which Samantha tells me is better, or you can make a call to the office 861-3191. Thank you very much for being here this morning.
Right,
thank you for sharing your art.
Thank you.
And thank you for making Newsmakers a part of your Sunday morning. Join us again next week to meet the men and the women helping us to understand our own community. Have a good week.
Ah.